My name is Simon Crowther. I'm a legal advisor at Amnesty International. Peaceful protest is protected under international human rights law in a number of ways. Firstly, it's protected under the right to freedom of peaceful assembly. And what this does is provides a positive duty on states, not just to allow protests and other assemblies, but to positively facilitate them. Secondly, the right to protest is protected under the freedoms of expression and association. And these provide that people need to be able to express themselves freely on the streets. They need to be able to associate in groups. And then finally, there's the freedom from torture and cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment and punishment. And when this comes into play in protests is when the police use force. And what this means is that where such force is misused and used in a way that's not allowed under international human rights law, the right kicks in and provides the ability, a prohibition, firstly, on that misuse, but secondly, a right to redress where that misuse causes suffering, causes significant pain. There are very limited instances in which the authorities can use force, such as batons. In practice, in sum, what these mean is that batons can only really be used in response to violence or a threat of imminent violence, and in defence then of officers or the public. And even in these limited circumstances, they should be never be used if a less harmful alternative is available, or if they're going to do more harm than good. So there are a number of principles in play here. Legally speaking, the first is the principle of legality, which means that force can only be used when it's clearly provided by law. And that law needs to be absolutely clear in its guidance as to when that force can be used, the circumstances that will make that force legitimate, and the circumstances in which that force can never be used. The second is the principle of necessity. And what this means is that if there is a less harmful alternative available, that is what should be used and not the more harmful policing methods. The third principle is that of proportionality. And what proportionality means is that the kind of force used should not do more harm than good. The police need to consider whether it's really key that they use force in the way that they plan, or whether there are other means, and whether the use of the force will do more harm than it will do good. The final is that the force needs to serve a legitimate purpose. And there are limited legitimate purposes for the use of force, such as batons. And this will, as I've said, be the protection of others, the protection of the officers. And in practice, there will be many instances where it's actually safer for officers to simply walk away, or to allow something to play out and to mount arrest later, rather than to use force. International law also requires accountability, and that means accountability for individual officers when they misuse force, but also for their superiors, and institutionally for law enforcement agencies such as police forces, where they have discriminatory practices or patterns of violations of human rights law. There needs to be checks and balances, in other words. There need to be inquiries into when force is misused, and there need to be prosecutions mounted in some instances where the misuse of force constitutes a criminal act. There also needs to be reporting of each instance in which force is used, so as to monitor trends and to see where things are going wrong within a police force. Unfortunately, in this project, we've documented numerous violations of human rights law. Firstly, we've seen use of batons on people who are restrained. Now, when someone's restrained, there's absolutely no legitimate law enforcement purpose for force to be used on them, particularly not force such as a baton. It's simply a means of inflicting pain, and in such instances will most likely constitute cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. And unfortunately, where the level of pain and suffering caused becomes severe, will constitute torture. We also see corporal punishment. And this is where batons are being used to punish people with pain. And again, there's no law enforcement purpose for this. It's clear, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment and torture in severe instances. Another area where we see misuse is where batons and other methods are used on heads and necks. This is a dangerous way for a baton to be used. There's an inherent risk of injury and significant damage to somebody's skull in the most extreme instances. And it's unlikely ever to be considered necessary or proportionate because there's always the availability of an alternative way of using the baton.